The town of Barlow Ridge was the kind of place that forgot it still existed. The sign at the county line leaned sideways, half swallowed by kudzu, its paint long since peeled to bone. Folks said the air there never felt right, too heavy in summer, too still in winter. They said it was because the land remembered what people tried to bury. At the end of Old Mill Road stood a house that hadn't breathed right in years. Its windows were blind, its porch sagged like a mouth missing its teeth. Locals drove by without looking, pretending not to see the faint light that sometimes flickered upstairs, long after midnight. Some swore it was just the wind moving through broken glass. Others, usually after their third drink, whispered that the family still lived there, all of them, no matter how long ago they'd died. The stranger came to Barlow Ridge without a badge on his chest or a name anyone could remember. He arrived at dawn, when the fog still clung to the pine trees like old breath, and the roads were nothing but ribbons of cracked asphalt winding through fields gone feral. His car was coated in red dust from the backroads, the kind that seeped into everything and stayed there, no matter how often you wiped it away. He didn't stop in town right away. He drove past the gas station with its single flickering light, past the rusted diner sign that buzzed like a dying insect, and straight toward the courthouse, a squat brick building that looked more like a tomb than a place of law. He parked out front, sat a while, and stared at the town map pinned to the wall inside through the glass. The map was faded, its corners curling with age, but he wasn't looking for streets. He was tracing the empty spaces, the ones with no names, the ones where records went missing, the ones that locals refused to talk about. He'd been sent by the state, or so his paperwork claimed. But there was something in the way he carried himself, something that made people wonder if he'd really come for justice or for something else entirely. In towns like Barlow Ridge, strangers didn't come unless they were lost or looking for something that didn't want to be found. He checked into a room above the old feed store, the kind of place that smelled of mildew and secrets. From his window, he could see the steeple of the abandoned church, its bell long silenced, and beyond that, the dark line of woods that everyone said wasn't safe after dusk. The whispers began the moment he arrived. Folks at the bar stopped talking when he walked in, their eyes darting between the mirror behind the counter and his reflection in it. They said a family lived out on Old Mill Road, or maybe they didn't live anymore, it depended on who you asked. A few said the women went missing because they wanted to. Others said they never had the chance. No one mentioned the patriarch by name, though. They just called him the man of the house, like he was a story they told their children to make them behave. The stranger kept a notebook in his coat pocket, filled with clipped reports and photographs too faded to make out. 3 names, 3 disappearances, all tied to one property the county had tried to condemn 5 times. He didn't believe in curses, at least not the kind that made crops fail or cattle die. But as he drove down the empty road that night, with the trees closing in and the air turning colder, he began to feel the kind of dread that didn't come from superstition. It came from knowing that whatever lived in that house had been waiting a long time for someone to open the door. The house on Old Mill Road appeared slowly through the fog, as though it didn't want to be seen all at once. The dirt path leading to it was lined with skeletal trees, their branches reaching out like blackened hands. The stranger's headlights cut through the mist, revealing pieces of the property in fractured glimpses, a rusted mailbox leaning at a drunken angle, a gate hanging by one hinge, a tire swing that moved on its own in the still air. The place looked abandoned from a distance, but the kind of abandonment that still breathed, still listened. The air changed as he drew closer, heavy with the scent of iron and damp wood. He could feel the silence pressing in, thick and unnatural, as if even the insects refused to speak here. The house itself was enormous, built in another century and never meant to survive this long. Its white paint had peeled to grey, and ivy crawled over its sides like veins reclaiming flesh. The porch steps sagged under his weight, boards groaning as if in warning. The door stood slightly open, its brass knob dull and cold, and though the stranger knew better, he pushed it wider with the back of his hand. The smell hit him first, something sweet and rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun. Dust motes hung suspended in the beam of his flashlight, swirling slowly in the air that hadn't been disturbed in years. Inside, the walls were lined with portraits, their faces faded but their eyes still bright. Every photograph showed the same family, generation after generation, each more somber than the last. The women had the same haunted expression, the same shape of jaw, the same trace of someone else's shadow behind their smiles. In the parlor, he found a piano covered in a film of dust. One key had been pressed down, wedged in place, as though frozen mid-song. Nearby, a child's shoe rested on the carpet, small enough to fit in his palm. He moved carefully, every creak of the floorboards sounding too loud. The house had that peculiar feeling of being aware, of listening. From upstairs came a faint thud, followed by the whisper of something dragging across wood. He froze, hand instinctively reaching for the revolver at his hip, though he doubted it would do much good here. The air grew colder, the faint smell of smoke drifting from somewhere deeper inside. He followed it down a narrow hall, where wallpaper peeled away to reveal old writing scrawled beneath a name repeated over and over again in a child's uneven hand. At the end of the hallway, he found a closed door, the only one in the house that seemed untouched by time. He reached for the handle, and the moment his fingers brushed the metal, the house exhaled. The deeper the stranger went into the house, the clearer it became that this place had never truly belonged to the living. The air itself seemed to tremble under the weight of memory, and everything, the furniture, the photographs, the cracked wallpaper, felt like part of a single, suffocating organism. He found a study near the back of the house, its door locked from the inside. When he forced it open, a thin gust of stale air escaped, carrying with it the smell of pipe smoke and old books. Dust coated everything, yet the chair behind the desk looked as if someone had just risen from it. Papers lay scattered across the floor, their ink blurred by moisture, though one name kept surfacing again and again in the fading script, the patriarch. No first name, no dates, only that single word, written as if it were a title rather than a person. He learned of the man piecemeal, through fragments, letters written in a trembling hand, photographs turned face down, a family Bible with pages torn out. The patriarch had been a preacher once, or claimed to be. He built his kingdom in that house with a voice that could charm or wound, depending on his need. The neighbors said he spoke of purity, of keeping bloodlines strong, of divine right. Behind the pulpit, he was a savior. Behind closed doors, he was something else entirely. The walls still carried the echo of his authority, a tone so commanding that even the creaks in the wood seemed to fall silent at his imagined presence. The stranger found a bedroom that looked untouched by decay, its bed perfectly made, a glass of water resting beside a worn Bible. On the vanity sat 3 hairbrushes, their handles identical but their bristles tangled with strands of different colors. It was a shrine disguised as an ordinary room. The mirror above the vanity was covered with a bedsheet, yellowed and stiff with age. When he pulled it away, he expected his own reflection. Instead, he found that the glass had clouded into a dull, silver haze, showing shapes that didn't quite match his movements. Behind him, faintly, stood the outline of a man, tall and lean, his face hidden in shadow. Every trace of the patriarch's life pointed to control, his sermons, his letters, his rules carved into the back of a closet door. But what unsettled the stranger most were the records he found tucked into the floorboards, birth certificates with names scratched out and rewritten, all bearing the same father. The paper crumbled when he touched it, but not before he noticed that the signatures were identical, even across generations. The ink was black, sharp, deliberate. It wasn't the hand of a man who thought he was sinning. It was the hand of one who believed he was eternal. He found the journal by accident, hidden behind the loose paneling of a hallway wall that groaned when touched. At first, he thought it was just another relic, a forgotten diary left to rot in the damp. But when he opened the cracked leather cover, the handwriting inside was sharp, deliberate, and alive in a way that felt wrong. The first page began with a date from 50 years earlier, but the ink looked fresh, as though it had been written that very morning. The words were uneven, spilling down the page without order or restraint, and yet every sentence pulsed with the same voice, the patriarch's. He wrote not like a man confessing sins, but like one recording a doctrine. The early entries read like sermons, dense with talk of lineage, purity, and divine order. He wrote of how the world outside the house had grown sick, of how only the blood within these walls remained untainted. His tone shifted from conviction to obsession, and then to something colder. He described his family as vessels, each chosen for a purpose that only he could define. He named them not as people, but as continuations, extensions of his own will. The more the stranger read, the clearer it became that the patriarch saw himself as both creator and redeemer, his power justified by his own twisted scripture. Later entries grew darker, fragmented by erratic handwriting and ink blots that bled through the paper. The patriarch began addressing someone directly, sometimes a daughter, sometimes a sister, sometimes both, as though he could no longer tell the difference. His words blurred time and identity until every person in the house became one body, one voice, one reflection of him. The entries described nights filled with ritual, silence, and prayer that felt more like punishment. There were mentions of births that happened in secret, and deaths that were never reported. The stranger's hands trembled as he turned the pages. Some of them were fused together with dried moisture, and when he peeled them apart, faint smudges of red marked his fingers. In one passage, the patriarch described sealing the house to protect it from outsiders, warning that the bloodline must never spill beyond these walls. There were notes written in another hand, smaller, delicate, please scratched into the margins. Please stop, he's watching, we are still here. The writing ended abruptly halfway through a sentence, as though the writer had been interrupted mid-thought. When the stranger closed the journal, the air in the house seemed to change. It felt heavier, charged, almost listening. From somewhere deep within the walls came a low, rhythmic sound, faint but steady, like breathing. The journal was no longer just evidence, it was a pulse, still beating after its author's body had long since turned to dust. The revelation came slowly, like the first sliver of moon breaking through storm clouds, and it left the stranger hollow before he even fully understood it. He had spent hours combing the house, tracing the echo of footsteps across the sagging floors, following faint stains in the carpet, and piecing together the fragmented whispers of the past. Each room seemed to whisper its own secret, and each secret pointed back to the patriarch, whose shadow lingered long after he was gone. But it wasn't until he found the small, hidden chamber behind the pantry, a space so narrow that the walls pressed close to his shoulders, that the truth began to crystallize. Inside were remnants of lives entwined in a way that defied the natural order, old photographs, carefully labeled, yet each face was connected by the same man's name, and a collection of journals stacked neatly in a corner, each chronicling the same horrors from different perspectives. The stranger realized with a cold certainty that the family he thought he was investigating had never been ordinary. Every birth certificate, every faded photograph, every note scribbled in the margins of the journals pointed to the same figure, the same twisted authority. The mother, the daughter, the sister, they were not just victims in separate timelines. They were bound together by the patriarch in a cycle of obsession, control, and perverse devotion that had been carefully recorded and preserved within the walls of this house. The patriarch's influence reached beyond death, his meticulous documentation ensuring that his legacy would survive, that no outsider could ever untangle the threads of blood and command he had woven. What made it worse was the way the house itself seemed complicit. It was built to conceal, to protect, to preserve the dark truth. Hidden panels, false floors, and rooms that led nowhere, all of it designed to trap the past in a suspended state. The stranger understood that this revelation was not something one could simply report and leave behind. The house did not want the truth exposed, and its very architecture seemed to resist his presence, whispering threats in the shifting shadows and the groaning timber. He found evidence that some of the women had tried to resist, leaving notes and markings in secret corners, but the patriarch's control had been absolute, shaping their lives with the precision of a sculptor. As he pieced together the timeline, the full weight of it descended on him. The horror wasn't just what had happened, but the realization that it had been allowed to continue, uninterrupted, for decades. And then he noticed something in the mirror at the far end of the chamber, faint but unmistakable, a reflection that didn't quite match his own, a lingering presence that seemed to watch him with patient, unblinking eyes. The stranger didn't expect the final piece to reveal itself so clearly, yet the house had a way of forcing acknowledgement. He had wandered the hallways for hours, the journals and photographs clutched in his hands, the dust thick in his lungs, and the weight of the patriarch's influence pressing from every corner. The deeper he went, the more the house seemed alive, not with spirits, but with intention, as if it had been designed to hold memory, control, and guilt like a living thing. Every door, every floorboard, every warped staircase led him closer to a room he hadn't noticed before, one hidden behind a false wall panel, small and suffocating. It smelled of damp earth and old wood, and yet beneath that, There was something unmistakably metallic, like dried blood. Inside, the chamber was a shrine to the patriarch's dominance, though it was almost too quiet to notice. Shelves lined one wall, filled with meticulously labeled jars containing objects too fragile and personal to describe, each tagged with a name, a date, and a note written in the patriarch's unmistakable hand. On the floor lay 3 cradles, each draped in tattered blankets that smelled of moths and decay. The stranger's eyes traced the names carved into the wooden edges: mother, daughter, sister. The recognition hit him with a physical force, a gut-wrenching clarity that made his stomach turn and his hands tremble. He saw what had been carefully hidden, the cruel symmetry of the patriarch's obsession laid bare, and he felt the suffocating inevitability of it all pressing down on him. As he moved deeper, he found a stack of ledgers, each chronicling births, deaths, and milestones in a way that read like a ledger for a business rather than a family. Each entry traced the lineage of the women back to the same man, marking his presence in every moment of their lives, ensuring that nothing existed outside his control. It became horrifyingly clear that the patriarch had not merely acted in secret, he had built a system, a private world where every person was an extension of him, every life measured and catalogued. The women's attempts at resistance, tiny scratches in the walls, coded notes in the margins of journals, were all visible to someone who knew where to look, and yet they had been too subtle, too desperate to matter. When the stranger turned to leave, he noticed movement in the shadows, a flicker of something alive, watching him, waiting. The house exhaled in that moment, as though confirming that the past was not simply memory but a presence, still lingering, still in command. Every corner, every whisper of the wind through broken windows, carried the patriarch's authority, a legacy of control that refused to die. The stranger realized, with a chilling finality, that he was not merely uncovering a story, he had stepped into a world that had been waiting for him to see it, and it was ready to ensure that its truth would endure, no matter the cost. The stranger's realization came in waves, each one heavier than the last, pressing the air from his lungs as he wandered through the house that seemed to breathe around him. He had thought he understood the scope of the patriarch's influence, that the journals, ledgers, and hidden chambers told the full story. But the deeper he probed, the more he sensed layers that had been meticulously concealed, histories folded inside histories, lives catalogued not only for control but for preservation. In a back room he had previously dismissed as a storage closet, he discovered a small trapdoor beneath a rotting rug. It gave way with the sound of splintering wood, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. A chill rose from the opening, carrying the scent of damp earth, decay, and something else, faint but unmistakable, the lingering presence of lives that had been tethered to this house, bound by the same man's authority. The steps led to a subterranean chamber, low-ceilinged and suffocating, its walls lined with shelves that held bundles of letters, photographs, and trinkets, each carefully wrapped in cloth or paper. The patriarch had catalogued them all, like a collector of human history, marking dates and names in his precise hand. But it was the placement of the items that made the stranger pause. They were organized not only by family or generation but by act and event, a timeline that traced the repetition of the same transgressions over decades. He saw the mother, the daughter, and the sister represented repeatedly, their lives chronicled in meticulous detail, each moment reduced to data points in a ledger of obsession. Among the bundles, he discovered journals written by the women themselves, hidden from the patriarch's eye. Their entries were fragmented, desperate, and full of coded warnings and confessions. He read passages where they spoke of fear and small acts of resistance, of nights spent hiding or whispering to one another, their voices interwoven in a tapestry of pain and survival. The stranger realized that these women had lived entirely within the shadow of the patriarch's control, their identities shaped and reshaped to maintain his dominance, yet they had carved small sanctuaries of agency wherever they could. As he pieced together these parallel narratives, the stranger began to understand the full horror. The patriarch's legacy was not just in what he had done, but in how he had structured the house and the lives within it to preserve control across generations. The house itself was a vessel of his will, a living record of dominance, secrecy, and manipulation. Every floorboard, every hidden compartment, every shadowed corner seemed designed to reinforce the hierarchy he had imposed. The realization hit him with a physical weight. The patriarch's presence lingered not only in memory or record, but in the very architecture of the house, a persistent, almost sentient force that demanded acknowledgement and perpetuated its authority without mercy or end.